Good morning, Emily.
Good morning, Dan.
Are we back to good morning? I'm really glad to hear it.
Yeah, finals are almost over.
Truly the light is at the end of the tunnel. Well, what are we talking about today?
Financial anxiety, retirement planning as a matter of cash flow and not age, and some frequently asked questions that we get a lot as financial planners.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay. With finals, I would expect anxiety to be the topic, but retirement planning as a number that's not age is an interesting one. And FAQs, there are so many FAQs, so sure, why not?
Precisely. All right, we're starting with anxiety. Again, pertains to my life, but
I'm very nervous. I'm very on edge now.
You're never nervous. I've never seen you be anxious, but I guess today's today.
Maybe I hide it really well. Maybe deep down, I'm like very neurotic.
Are you?
No, not in the slightest.
Yeah, that's what I thought. We're talking about client anxiety anyway, or at least that's what I'm starting with here. You know, we work with a lot of people that come in and they're anxious about money for a variety of reasons. But, where does this actually come from? What is the root of all this for them generally?
So anxiety, there's sort of academic and research-based definitions for anxiety and financial stress, and they're not quite synonyms, but they sort of live in the same neighborhood, as it were. But typically speaking, financial stress is going to produce financial anxiety or sort of vice versa. I think the easiest way to line up what that is that there is a real or perceived mismatch between financial resources that are available and financial resources that are believed to be necessary either presently or in the future. So, you are making a living, but your cost of living is going up, your rent is going up, your bills are going up, you have a car breakdown or a medical bill or something. And the mismatch between your current resources and your perception or the very, very real reality of how much money you need causes that sort of anxiety or stress.
Do you think that's the only reason or the main reason?
Well, that's just an example of what can produce it, but that's sort of the if you really take a step back, that kind of is the universal thing, because let's take that phrasing around, real or perceived, and really look at the perceived part, right? You and I have talked to clients who have, let's say, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, and they are financially anxious about their ability to retire. They're like, I don't know if I have enough. I don't know if I'm ready to make the jump from financially independent to being retired. Right? We have clients, and I know that you could imagine who I'm talking about when I say this, who we've worked with now for many years, who definitely could have retired the day they met us. But, one of them kept working for another couple of years. The other one is just going to be retiring now this summer. And they always had the money to be financially independent. They always had the resources and means to retire pretty much at any time since we started working with them. But they've had to take some time to overcome their financial anxiety, because even though they do realistically and legitimately have the resources to meet their current and future needs, they still just don't feel that way. And it's taken some time for them to sort of work through that and kind of overcome that feeling to finally be able to make the shift into being retired.
Sure. I think I know exactly who you're talking about. We've met with them many times. Okay, so if you're guiding the conversation, then let's use them as kind of example. What is it that you're trying to do as a financial planner to kind of help them get over that anxiety? Is there much that you can do, or is that all just work that they have to do on their end?
Well, so the baseline thing here is, and something you learn as a financial planner really early on, is that the numbers are never enough, right? So like we showed those clients a plan back in like 2021 showing like you are gonna be able to retire, right? Like just right now, if you want to quit working, you can. The math is the math, you'll be fine. And that wasn't enough, and that isn't enough. And so the role of a financial planner in this type of conversation is to not just present the facts and say those are the facts. It is to show that, right, to create some degree of certainty, right? We can agree that the math is the math. and then to sort of dig at and discuss, hey, so you still seem anxious. What's driving that? Well, I'm really worried about the impact of healthcare costs. Well, I mean, that's in the model, but what is it about healthcare that concerns you, right? Or I'm really worried about, retiring at the same time that we still have two kids in college. And how are we going to afford to pay for all of our own things and for our kids? So that's going to be more money than we've ever spent in a given year, even when we're both working and making all the same money and so on. Right. So it's a matter of sort of digging at, you're saying you're stressed, you're saying you're anxious, or you're worried about it, but what is driving it? Because it's not, in that type of situation, it's not the money causing the problem. Something else is causing the problem. In turn, sometimes people have very real and legitimate financial stress or financial anxiety, which is the math don't math, right? And so we're looking at it and saying, okay, right now to accomplish your objectives, you need to reduce your spending, or you need to increase your income, or you're going to have to work longer, or we're going to need to be more aggressive with your investments to make up the difference. And so that anxiety or that stress is much more, I don't want to say legitimate. I think that makes an emotional term loaded to say, well, your feelings are invalid because the math works for you, but your feelings are more valid if the math doesn't work for you. And so in that type of context, it's really a conversation about, okay, in one case, what is really the root of the problem? Can we discuss that and work through that? And what's going to make you feel more comfortable with your situation? And in cases where there's a more realistic type of financial stress occurring, what is necessary within the bounds of your ability to do it that's going to help you accomplish the financial outcomes you're looking for?
Do you find that like talking through it more in various situations helps with them? Like if someone is anxious about not having enough money, you can show them, okay, this is what it looks like if you work longer or make more. This is what it looks like if you spend less, et cetera. Even if they're not necessarily your specific recommendations, do you still take the time to show them each scenario?
Yeah, because on the other side of that, for the person who is going to be able to retire or be financially independent or pay for whatever that thing is, we'll do the opposite. We'll say, you're perfectly fine, but what if 2008 happens again? You're perfectly fine, but what happens if one of you needs long-term care? You're perfectly fine, but what if one of you suddenly passes away? So we do sort of the buffering, here's all the options to meet your objectives version on sort of the positive side. And we also do, here's all the negatives that could happen, and you'll still be fine on the negative side, right? It's important to contextualize that financial stress can kind of go both directions, right? I have so much, and I'm worried about misusing it or losing it, or otherwise not being able to make ends meet because I made a mistake. And conversely, I'm worried that I'm not going to make it. How do I make it? And just being able to show options, because it's one of the nice things about being financial planners who aren't paid based on the money we manage necessarily or the products we sell or something like that. We're indifferent to how a client accomplishes their goal. If you want to work longer, that's fine. If you want to save more, that's fine. If you want to be more aggressive with your investments, that's fine. What matters to us is that we can agree on a path that works for you, and that we don't find ourselves in a situation where we want to have our cake and eat it too, where I don't want to save more, I don't want to be more aggressive, I don't want to work longer, I don't want to spend less, but also I want to retire on money that's not adequate to do that. And so in that particular case, it's a matter of reconciling, okay, well, we have to do at least one of those, maybe two of those, maybe three of those for your goals to be possible. And until we can align on how that's possible, then we're going to have to continue to have conversations and work through it. Because often, again, the numbers are the numbers, the math is the math, but it is an emotional decision to make lifestyle decisions, right? To make work and career decisions, to make family decisions, right? Sometimes the thing you need to spend less money on is a family member you care about, right? Or a cause you care about, or making more money means leaving a company that you will feel really passionate about to pursue an opportunity that's going to be more financially viable for you that you may not have the same sort of passion for. So it really becomes a question of what is the path that's going to meet you where you are, right? Whether you're on the positive or the negative side of this question, and what is going to help you accomplish the outcome you're trying to obtain. And part of what I want to be careful with as I say that is I've used retirement and financial independence as an example here, but it's not just, meeting you halfway so you can retire. This could be paying for your kid's school. This could be taking care of an elderly parent. This could be changing careers from a field you hate to a field you love. Right? Financial anxiety can be produced by a whole variety of things that are not necessarily just self-interested financial independence situations.
Sure. Well, I've seen with several people, both at work and just in my personal life, that kind of making that first change is the hardest part, that first step towards whatever it is that you're trying to kind of alter for the future here. Is there much you can do to kind of help them get through that first initial paralysis stage? Because once you make one change or you choose the path you're going to go down, it gets a little bit easier over time. But how do you take that first step?
So I think, like anything, it is the really the core thing of financial planning. The value in financial planning is not the creation of the plan; it is the iterative process of planning. And in that sense, it's in that implementation process where it's like, look, we could do planning where we gather your data, we create a plan model, we print off a checklist of stuff for you to do, hand it over, and say, if you get all this done, you'll be fine. And to your point, to your question, right, most people need help doing small progressive improvements. And so, in that sense, right, helping them get one thing done, right? We reduced your cost of insurance. Now you have that much more money every month. Terrific. Now that we have that extra money, can we agree that it's a good idea to go ahead and deploy that towards paying down your credit card debt? Yes, terrific. Okay. And then once we've gotten your credit card debt paid down, can we agree that using some of the savings from the insurance cost reduction and your credit card, bill finally being dropped down to zero and not having to pay so much interest anymore, that it now makes sense to deploy some of that towards saving for your kids' college. So it's sometimes just a look. The checklist might always be there. There might be a version of that, but sometimes people need somebody to say, you can do this, to acknowledge that they've done it and say, good job, and then to help them take the next progressive step in improving their financial situation.
Yeah. Even as much as I like a checklist, I love that. That doesn't work for me either. I think I had a job when I was a teenager, a long time ago, and there's some guy there named Brant who I absolutely loved, and he told me way back then when I was way younger, and it was excellent advice. He's like, you need to start investing right now. And he explained, this is going to compound, and I understood the whole. He's like, you just got to start investing, and I was nodding and agreeing, and I was like, yeah, I should. And I didn't know what that meant at the time, and so I didn't do it. And then months later, I talked to him again. I was like, Brant, I don't know how to invest. And he goes, well, just, S&P 500, something like that. Just look it up. You can figure it out. That seemed very overwhelming at the time, and I didn't do it. And now that I'm in my 30s, why didn't I invest when I was a teenager when Brant told me to? Like, I had someone educating me, trying to help me a little bit. And to him, it was so obvious. He's like, yeah, just simply do this. And that as a little to-do list or to-do item on my list produced nothing, and it went nowhere.
This is sort of my core objection to DIY finance. Like, I'm all for people getting more financial knowledge, becoming more financially literate, and so on. But there's always this snuck premise of, I've done it, so can you. Right? Like, I climbed Mount Everest. All you have to do to climb Mount Everest is walk up Everest. Like, okay, yeah, but I don't know how to ice climb. I don't know how to do the oxygen tank thing and not like freeze to death or die of hypoxia to climb up Mount Everest. Like, I get it. Put one foot in front of the other and eventually you'll get to the top. But like, I don't actually know how to do that. And I think it's easy, even for us as financial planners, to easily sort of overwhelm people with jargon and language, like, oh, we're just going to invest in a diversified portfolio of ETFs that mirror the S&P 500 and various other indexes in the United States, as well as overseas, as well as some fixed income implements like corporate bonds and U.S. Treasury bonds and all of that. It makes perfect sense. And to a lot of people, nothing I just said makes sense. And in that context, right, that's where the iterative thing comes in. It's easy for us to just jump to, just do the thing. Like, yes, but like how? What does that mean? Why is it important? Right? Because sometimes there's also a motivational factor, which is, I don't, like, I understand that you're telling me this is good for me, but I don't understand how or why. Right. And for Brant here, it sounds like he told you the why. Compounding interest will be good for you. You're young. It's going to be great for you to save and invest and make money doing that. And you're like, cool, but I don't know how. And his answer was like, it's not that hard, figure it out. Well, clearly it was just hard enough.
It was. And I didn't even have like a retirement account at that time. I didn't have anything. So I was like, invest in what? I didn't even understand like the very basics of how to do that. And here I am. I didn't, do anything.
Well, and I mean, let's even break down how simple advice can be difficult. Emily, invest in an ETF.
If I'm a standard person, I have to look up what is an ETF? What are different kinds of ETF should I invest in? How much am I investing? Does that amount need to change over time? I don't know anything about that. That's too much.
Well, and let alone, right, if you Google what is an ETF, it pops up and says it's an exchange traded fund. What is an exchange traded fund? It's a basket of investments. Okay, what kind of investments? It's a pool of common stocks or bonds or other securities instruments. I thought security had something to do with like cameras and like people in uniforms with badges. Like what are it's like there's just this linguistic thing where again, once you understand it, it's not that hard. It's not that complicated. But it is a foolish part on the part of many of us to sometimes look at a friend who's undergoing financial stress and say something like, "Well, just pay off your credit card debt." Okay, what is the most efficient and effective way to do that? Use the snowball method. I don't know what that is. Oh, use the avalanche method. I don't know what that is either. Well, one is more efficient for interest payments, and one is more efficient for making you happy, and so on. Well, okay, but like, which is better for me? Well, whichever one works best for you. I don't know how to assess that. So that is sort of the thing with financial stress, financial anxiety. A lot of us think we're helping, right? It's the same, and we see the same thing in like diet and exercise, in hobbies and interests, all sorts of things, right? When we're experts at the thing, we think it's no big deal to do the expert things, and in turn, most people need to be met where they are and be helped from where they are to where they're trying to get to.
Yeah. Well, we do plenty of that every day here. So I'm getting better at it now, but in hindsight, missed some opportunities there. Hopefully, Brant is listening, and at least I remembered his advice.
Hey, and kudos to Brant for trying to help.
And he was so nice. He was the nicest guy, but I wasted his advice. I did not. He should have given it to someone else.
No, I think it's still valuable that you got it. My dad gave me a copy of Rich Dad Poor Dad when I was like 12, and I think I read the first two chapters and said this is boring, and stopped reading it. But it was well intended. It wasn't just because I didn't utilize it or implement it, and also now by the power of hindsight, knowing what I know, I'm glad I didn't do what's in Rich Dad Poor Dad because holy shit, tax fraud. But just generally speaking, right, there's still a good intent here. It's just that sometimes people need a little bit more than your good intentions.
Yeah, my mom is obsessed with Dave Ramsey, and so she's always like, "You got to, don't have any debt, Emily." It's like, well, that is generally good advice, most, in some ways, but she takes it very seriously in ways that aren't always financially optimal.
And again, well intended, but if I'm willing to lend you money at a 1% interest rate, and there's 4.5% CDs out there, there's some free money out there for you, right? So there's always an opportunity for leverage there.
Certainly. Okay, well, I've talked about this enough. Here's my smooth transition into topic number 2, retirement planning.
It's always so smooth, Emily. Thank you.
I like a list, as we've talked about. I do everything in this format. Okay. So when we're talking to clients, there's something you say all the time. A common question is like, okay, well, when can I retire, or at least be work optional? And you always say to people, it's not about an age thing. It's more of a cash flow question. Like, you could retire today, but at what quality of life? It's not about an age.
Yeah, I mean, and more so to the point, cash flow is sort of the crux of the issue, but it really is a quality of life question, right? Anybody in America can be retired today. You just have to be comfortable in a refrigerator box. So in that context, given that most people don't want to live in a refrigerator box or in a sleeping bag under a bridge or something like that, it becomes a question of what is a sufficient amount of resources both to provide a adequate quality of life, and then for how long, right? Because if it's going to be something that's only happening for, let's say, 10 years, I need less money. But if it needs to last me for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, I need more money. And it may be the case that I actually don't need more money, but there's an uncertainty factor with how long that is, that I need to account for that uncertainty by having more resources to be able to absorb unforeseen events.
Okay, well, that kind of brings up the question we always get then after you tell them that is, okay, well, how do I anticipate things like that? Like, for example, I don't know how long I'm going to live. Yeah, there's genetics and I can look at my parents and certain things, but I really don't know how long I'm going to live. How can I possibly plan for that?
I think the baseline here is you plan to live longer than you otherwise would expect or maybe want to, right? Almost every time we tell a client that we build a plan expecting they could live out to 100, they're always like, oh my God, I'm not going to live that long. I don't want to live that long. Please kill me. And everybody laughs, but like that's sort of the baseline assumption. But when it comes to the unknowns, I think it just becomes a question of confidence versus sort of commitment, right? And to give you the idea here, there's maybe two very far apart extremes in how we think about how do you like, prepare for financial independence. One is a very committed, secure route. You work for, let's say, the St. Vrain Valley School District, you earn para, right? You contribute to para, and that benefit grows over time. And eventually, that benefit is large enough at a certain age that contractually you're going to receive a certain level of income every month for the rest of your life if you claim para. And so you've made a commitment to this employer, to this retirement scheme to provide you with an income at a point of retirement. And at some point, you know that there will be a crossover between what it provides and what you need. And at that kind of point, at that stage, you're only working longer because you want to, or because you have more financial commitments than you can actually meet based on just living on para, or you want a bigger benefit, or whatever the case is. The other extreme is somebody who's gone for a pure return approach, right? So they've invested heavily in their 401k, 403b, 457, their TSP, whatever they have. They've funded a Roth. They've put money into a brokerage account. They've been really equity heavy and very aggressive with their investments their whole lifetime. And that person is using confidence and probability to say, look, I know that if I'm this aggressive, I'm going to be on the roller coaster ride for the markets. And sometimes I'm going to be really upset about it. And sometimes I'm going to be really happy about it. But I have confidence based on all the available evidence that this should work out for me long term, right? As long as I can stomach the roller coaster experience. And so, to the question of how do you account for or accommodate the what ifs and the unforeseens, it is a question of what your strategy is going to be in retirement. Am I going to have this kind of contractually driven fixed income approach from pensions or Social Security or a combination thereof? Or am I going to build my strategy around tolerating the volatility and the unknowns, but also in so doing, capturing whatever kind of risk premium exists for doing that and use that to offset the downturns?
Can you do like a hybrid of that? There's another common follow-up then. It's like, well, can't I get a certain amount of, fixed income essentially, and then maybe the other half of my stuff I'm riskier with and aggressively invested?
So yeah, there's deliberate strategies like a risk wrap strategy where you essentially buy as many guarantees as are needed to fund your necessities. So you have Social Security, you have para, you buy annuities, particularly fixed income type annuities, where we're just going to start receiving a stream of income. And let's say if my cost of living is $5,000 a month, then between Social Security and para and annuities and whatever else is available to me, I buy that income. Right, I commit as many financial resources as necessary to that, and then with the rest of my money, I go ahead and stay high risk and aggressive because I don't necessarily need that amount to move forward. So if I've taken that risk wrap approach to this, then functionally what's happening with that is, I have guarantees and now I can take more risks in the market. And the reality is, right, if you have Social Security or if you have para or something like that, you are doing that hybrid strategy in most cases. The interesting thing is that people don't often account for that on their own. And what can happen as a result of that is they say, okay, yes, I've got Social Security. Yes, I've got para. Yes, my spouse has this annuity, et cetera, et cetera. And so we've got all our necessities met under this risk wrap strategy. But also, I'm still looking at my portfolio and I feel like it's very aggressive. And I want to de-risk my portfolio and have like a 60-40 portfolio or 50-50 portfolio. I want as low risk as possible. And as a planner, it sometimes becomes my role to look at you and say, well, why? Because all your necessities are already funded. So why are we being so cautious and careful with the extra? Now, there's plenty of valid reasons to be cautious and careful with the extra. But for a lot of people, it's being very conservative through these fixed income instruments and these, kind of annuitized pension type instruments. And then it's also being overly conservative with their investments without any particular directive or reason for it.
Right. They just want that security, which is relatable to me. I mean, how much of an impact, of course, de-risking and stuff, you're going to get less returns. But if someone chooses a certain route, whether it be hybrid, aggressive, or more conservative, and then they want to change their mind after a few years, is there, I mean, if you're building a financial plan, are they going to be flexible enough to accommodate these changes that people make pretty much 100% of the time? You never pick a strategy and stick to it for 50 years with what I see. People always change their minds.
Well, I'm going to push back on that because I've definitely seen people stay committed to their strategy long term. But I mean, to give you an example, it's a question of how flexible you're willing to be given the risks that come with your strategy. So let's say you are, taking that super duper fixed income, pension heavy, annuity heavy approach. Well, the pushback that's going to occur there, your biggest risk is going to be inflation risk. because most sources of kind of pension or annuity income don't necessarily have pure inflation riders. Like para caps out at the greater of either inflation or 1% a year. Social Security does cost of living adjustments based on the CPIU, but it's not perfect. They do occasionally miss that, and it may not be the CPIU, it might be the CPIE. There's a inflation index for senior costs, and it's a CPI something. Anyway, but regardless, you have sort of the fact that your pension, your Social Security, et cetera, may not keep pace with inflation or that particular risk, and so then you are forced to pivot to utilizing your liquid resources, if any. Conversely, somebody might have a pure risk approach, and that might work great for them in the long run, but in short-term bursts, they might lose 20, 30, 40% of their money. And what's going to behoove them in that situation is being open to doing something like cutting back on their expenses, cutting back on their trips, cost of living, whatever, or tapping into resources like their home equity, utilizing a HELOC or a reverse mortgage or a home equity collateralized mortgage to go ahead and bridge their quality of life expenses during that volatile down period in the market, and then being willing to turn that back on and off, right, as needs be over time. And not everybody is flexible enough to take pure advantage of that. But those strategies are only as viable as you're able to follow them and adapt to conditions that challenge their viability.
So there has to be that willingness to continually check in both with your personal life and what's going on in the world and the markets and continually adapt.
Or financially sort of bulletproof yourself on it, right? If you work until you're 70 and you build up way more savings than you need, such that you're probably going to die on a pile of money, then problem solved, right? You can afford to maintain your complete quality of life and not be flexible. But if you're trying to retire at 45, you are taking a big risk, both from longevity, but also from that sequence of returns risk and from the kind of unknown factors that needs to be offset by either being more flexible in your retirement expectations, or you need to have won the lottery or had an equity cash out event or something that gives you far more financial resources than you need to retire. Like I can retire right now, right? But I would be retiring very young. And I would have to be extremely flexible and cognizant of the limitations that come with retiring so young, because I'm 34 right now, and if I live to 95, like some of my great grandparents, okay, that's a 65 year or 60 year run, 61 year run. That's a lot of uncertainty. And so even though I have the literal financial resources to stop working and fund my lifestyle as it exists today, that doesn't mean that conditions are going to be beautiful and wonderful and easy for the next 60 years, such that I couldn't potentially be wrong at some point and need to make a shift to make it work.
Yeah, that would be an incredibly bold move if you were to do that. I would be surprised.
Well, and also I love what I do and have no interest in doing that. But that is still just a thing that I'm aware of, right? I'm past that point of financial independence, in consideration of risks and so on. And if I'm past that point of financial independence, why do I work? Why do I continue to do it? For me, it's not a risk decision. It's because I love what I do. It's because I want to make an impact in this field and with the public and our clients and make the world a better place in that sense. But I have to be cognizant of the fact that that is a luxury decision I'm making relative to the fact that I don't have to do it. Right? I am choosing to spend my time. I'm choosing to spend my energy on this activity, as opposed to just kicking back and reading a lot of books and having a really well kept yard.
Yeah, well, you would enjoy some of that, but not all of it.
I do hate yard work.
You do, and you have a surprisingly large yard for someone who hates yard work.
I have a beautiful, hardworking green thumb wife who says that is her domain.
There you go. You've got the perfect setup then.
There it is.
All right, we're switching to number 3, your favorite part, Dan. Frequently asked questions that we get as planners.
I look forward to answering all the questions I get to ask frequently or answer frequently.
Yes, I'm sure you'll have good answers. It's not your first rodeo here. Okay, so one of the biggest ones, people always say, well, I could manage my 401k or retirement accounts, whatever they have, all by myself. Why would I hire you? I'm doing all right.
If the sole reason you want to hire me specifically is to manage your investments, that is probably not a good choice. Because I make no claims to be a great, wonderful, earth-shatteringly good investor. I'm not going to produce alpha. I'm not going to, beat the market and provide excess returns, etc. I think there's 2 reasons to hire a financial planner around investments, and they sort of are 2 extremes. One is just the spot check. I seldom see somebody who has a collection of investments that are perfect in the sense that they are, immune from all mistakes, that they've chosen the most optimal funds for their particular objectives, that they're not paying too high of expenses or expense ratios or have too much tax inefficiency, et cetera, et cetera. So I think almost anybody would benefit by talking to a financial planner to get their portfolio set straight, whether they then need it managed going forward or not. The second reason, and the more ongoing reason, is because unless you have the time, energy, experience, and enthusiasm to manage your portfolio appropriately, and that's not to say that you're just like staring at it every day and trying really, really hard to, time everything right and so on, because the professionals are really bad at that, which we could talk about later. But if the focus is to, make sure your money is managed correctly and done right the first time, you could do far worse than just hiring somebody else who does that for a living to do that for you. Doesn't mean that they're going to be day trading or making adjustments every single week or month or something, but that they're going to make the appropriate adjustments at the appropriate time aligned with your long-term goals. And if you have the time, energy, enthusiasm, and education to do that right for yourself, why would you hire us? But the frank truth of the matter is that almost nobody has that time, energy, enthusiasm, or particularly education to do it right the first time.
Very true. All right, let's skip back a sec to what you kind of touched on there is that, the professionals aren't necessarily doing a better job either. Expand on that a little bit.
So I'm not talking so much about like your financial advisor, your financial planner. That's a whole secondary level, but just talking about the ecosystem of investment products. There are thousands of investment products, right? So large cap mutual funds, small cap mutual funds, international emerging markets funds, leveraged funds, credit based funds, bond funds, all sorts of things, right? And in the universe of investment products, the probability that any fund manager year over year is going to beat the index that they compare themselves to is usually something like a coin flip. And in certain sectors, it's better, right? So, like in kind of emerging markets, international markets, you see slightly better performance. In real estate funds, you see slightly better performance by these professional fund managers. But in the long term, when you say, are they going to beat the market every year for 5 years, for 10 years, for 15 years, and so on, you quickly find out that the average fund manager cannot, on an enduring basis, beat the benchmarks to which they are compared. It's like the large cap blend fund managers who charge 0.5% or 0.75% a year to manage a collection of stocks that fit into the large cap category often are underperforming a basic S&P 500 index. And so, in that sense, you can pay a lot of money for professional product managers to try to beat the market and prove their value. But the simple fact of the matter is, particularly over long runs, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, essentially none of them can do it in excess of their benchmark. And so at that point, you're paying a lot of extra money in fees for underperformance. So from that standpoint alone, when I say they're not very good at it, the point here is not that Dan Yerger is going to manage your portfolio and beat the market. It's not that I'm going to pick an S&P 500 index fund that somehow outdoes the S&P 500 index. It's that you really probably should not be spending very much on investment management specifically in the first place. Right. And so in that particular sense, you can waste a lot of money on bad products. You can also overpay a lot for investment management services. And so back to my core answer, if all you're doing is hiring somebody like me to manage your portfolio and that's it, it's probably not a very good value proposition.
That is a very good answer. That was not your first time. All right. Frequently asked question number 2. There's these budget tracking apps that are everywhere. What can you do for me that they can't? Why do I need you to look over my budget and my cash flow and everything for me?
In same single source issue, right? If all you need is somebody to tell you what you're spending money on, like your bank does that, technically. You technically know what you spend your money on. I think the baseline answer here is that that's a great automated thing. You could use You Need a Budget, YNAB, or Monarch Money, or Personal Capital, or all sorts of things. You used to have Mint and Quicken and various things like that that will categorize your spending and tell you if you're reaching your arbitrarily set budget line and so on. I think the better answer here is that's information. It's not a recommendation of what to do with it. Typically, a financial planner, when it comes to budget things, is going to be really good at helping you allocate your resources to accomplish your objectives. So a budget app can tell you, hey, every month you've got $376 left over, and then nudge you to open a savings account or open a brokerage account or something like that. But that's kind of as far as that goes. And some of these apps are free, quote unquote, but then the way they make money is they sell products or financial services to then capture some of that extra money. But in turn, right, that doesn't really help align anything long term. A lot of people will come to us and say, I don't know where our money goes. Well, great. We'll look at your spending and we'll tell you where your money goes. But then once we know where it's going, we can then have more constructive conversations and help you establish systems to better automate making sure that money goes to what's important to you first, and that you then get to enjoy things in the back end of that as you may see fit.
Hmm. Another well thought out answer. Okay, number 3. I'm young and I don't need estate planning, and that is one of the services that you guys offer. It's kind of all bundled together, right? I don't need that. Why should I look at my estate planning?
There's an old expression which is that everybody has an estate plan, including people without an estate plan, because we have intestacy laws. So if you do not have a will or a trust or other estate instructions and powers of attorney and so on established, the government is going to decide what happens to your stuff. And I love to invoke like the Ron Swanson scene where Ron Swanson in Parks and Rec says, like, I don't need a will. They're, lawyers are amongst the most useless people on earth. And the accountant looks at him and goes, well, I'm just saying, Ron, if you don't get a will in place, the government's going to decide what happens with your stuff. And suddenly Ron Swanson immediately wants to meet this lawyer because he hates the government more than he hates lawyers. And it's the same thing for anybody, right? If you do not have these documents in place and these instructions in, guiding where your financial resources, your personal assets, and so on should go, let alone your pets, your kids, right? Who you want to have taken care of as part of your family or your situation and so on. The government has laws in place that are going to decide that for you. So everybody has an estate plan. The question is, does it align with the government's estate plan? There's also reasons like cost, right? If you go to court intestate, right? If your estate goes there and some family member has to go to the court and say, hey, they didn't have a will or a trust or anything, so I'm here to represent their interests and try to distribute their estate. It's going to incur a lot more in legal fees and court costs than if you had this stuff planned out in the first place. And so, yes, you may be young, you may be single, you may not have kids, etc. But the fundamental question here is, do you want to make your estate plan? Or do you want some magistrate who's never met you and never heard of you and doesn't care about you to make your estate plan?
Kind of concerning. Very good. Okay. 4th and final frequently asked question here. If you guys don't file my taxes for me, what sort of tax planning benefits can I get from hiring a planner? What are you going to do for me?
Tax preparation and tax planning are two completely separate services. And I think it's funny because a lot of people confuse them. So your question invokes one version of the confusion, which is, if you're not filing my taxes, how are you helping me plan for taxes or improve my situation for taxes? And the inverse happens to tax preparers all the time. So they're being paid the $300, $400 to just fill out tax forms and submit them. And then the customer or the client in this case, says like, well, why aren't you helping me pay less taxes? And the answer is because you're not paying me to. It's not my job. I just fill out the forms and submit them for you. So tax planning is the proactive activity of making financial decisions, whether that is contributions to certain types of accounts, distributions from certain types of accounts, the aggregation of various financial decisions throughout the course of a year or across several years to pay no less in taxes than is required by statute and law, and no more than is required by statute and law, right? And to do that not just in the current year where I'm trying to get the biggest return possible, but more so to say, hey, over the next 60 years of your life, how can we reduce the amount of taxes you pay in totality? That's tax planning. And you don't have to file each year by year tax return to implement tax planning. I think highly competent, highly skilled tax preparers, right, and tax professionals are one type of specialization that really is a full-time job. And I think tax planning is a specialization that also requires pretty much a full-time job. And there are some people who can do both, but then those same people are probably not doing as much estate planning, investment management, insurance stuff, et cetera. They're really focusing on the tax picture. And in turn, I think there's a great partnership between full-time financial planners who kind of look at the holistic set of circumstances and make recommendations across the board, and a full-time tax preparer who not only understands all the planning stuff that's being implemented and recommended, but is also 100% capable of structuring the tax returns to minimize tax liability both presently and into the future.
So would you recommend for a lot of people both having a planner as well as a tax preparer and having them work in tandem with each other and communicate?
I think it's a great partnership. There are some firms that offer both where they do have professional tax preparers in-house and planners in-house. I'm a little wary of people who claim to be really good at both. And in that, it's not to say that they can't be good at both, but that's a very premium service. And so if somebody is saying they'll do that for you and it's only $600 a year, No, they're not. Like, you cannot, it's not economically viable. So that type of service is available for somebody who, let's say, pays $10,000-$20,000 a year to like a wealth management firm with a tax preparation focus, or to a family office or something like that. But like, if you come to me and say, Dan, I'm going to pay you $8,000 a year, do my tax planning and also fill out my tax return, I'll say, I'll do your tax planning and I'll talk to your tax preparer, but it's not worth it to me in time spent in my business to do your planning, investments, insurance, estates, all this other stuff, and also to spend 4 to 8 hours a year filling out your tax return, following up on any notices, chasing down the fact that the state sent back a thing, and so on and so forth. It's just not an economic use of time for me. So just recognizing that Hearn's law shows up in this quite a bit. You will pay for what you get. You'll be lucky if you get what you pay for. And so, an in-house, all-in-one tax preparer, tax planner, and also comprehensive financial planner, wealth manager, et cetera, is a premium good and not one that is cheaply obtained.
Sure. All right. Well, plenty to think about, as always, Dan. Do you have any final follow-up questions for me?
I do. Emily, what is it that you've learned in the last few weeks since you were last on the podcast that you'd love to share with our audience?
Oh, let's see. Well, okay, so we've been reading this book. Well, I have, but the whole team has been reading it here at work, right? And what's it called? Uncomparable. And it's talking a lot about developing your niche as a financial planner and marketing yourself and all these kind of things. So I don't know if it's quite something I've learned as more of like an inspirational reminder, which I actually like. I do well with things like that. I like continuing to learn and develop and whatever. So there's always kind of this worry in my brain that, like, a few decades from now, supposedly I'll be a very good financial planner. I'll never have any more questions. Wrong. You should always have questions. You should always be learning. You should always be specializing in either something new or continuing to go deeper in your existing specialty that I would theoretically have by then. So, short answer to the question, getting to develop a niche later in life is very, very exciting for me because I like being extremely good at what I do. And if you have a niche, you certainly can.
Yeah, I look forward to you being the subject matter expert for three-fingered jugglers.
We'll see. I've already ruled out several options that made sense, so I'm actually back at square one.
That's all right. Sometimes you can get just as far ahead by figuring out what you're not going to do and not going in the wrong direction than you can by trying to decide what you're going to do and taking a direction and finding out later that doesn't make sense.
Very true. Also an inspirational reminder.
I'm very inspiring, as you know.
Never anxious and very inspirational. There we go.
Write it on my tombstone. The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.